Saudi Arabia is in a really interesting position here, my friends. And by interesting, I mean not necessarily a good one. If you've been on the internet in the past few years, I'm sure that you've seen videos of extremely ambitious, massive, and frankly just mind-boggling construction projects that have been planned in Saudi Arabia, some of which have started, some of which have not. It's a really mixed thing. Now, some of these seek to reclaim the expansive desert with ultra-modern cities. Others seek to imagine a new age of urbanism, whether on land or even at sea. And while it is that we are now in the age of AI, and these projects might be another generated image designed to reimagine life in some of the most inhospitable environments on the planet, the reality has been a little bit more painful. I'm here to tell you that at least in some of these cases, these projects are very real, and they're just one part of a massive undertaking by the Saudi Arabian government to reimagine their society. Called Vision 2030, the Saudi royal family and the nation seek to transform the country through massive construction projects, economic revitalization, and government reforms. Though a little bit less on the social side of things, we should say. Some have happened, but other things can be said. Still though, the problem with 2030 here is that as the project nears its target completion date, which is the year 2030, projects are extremely over budget. They are way behind schedule, and now a lot of them have been heavily reduced in size. A once long slash of urbanization to the desert has been scaled back to just a peninsula. Investments have changed priorities, and the project's future is now in serious doubt. In fact, the overwhelming majority of people seem to have accepted by now that 2030 is not going to be possible at all. Will the vision be able to come into reality, or is this dream of a beautiful Vision 2030 something that is more set to turn into a nightmare? Well, my friends, let's go ahead and dive in. Oh yeah, and also side note here, I know that every single time that I go and travel, the world decides to light itself on fire. If you want to be potentially part of that experience, you can join me in Greece or Croatia or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of trips here, and if you really want to travel with me this summer to Greece and Croatia, the spots for that are going to be expired in like 3 weeks now, I think at this point. It's like the last chance to be able to get tickets to travel with me here this summer. So if you want to go on an adventure and learn some history, do that. And then we can potentially watch the world burn. Oh my God, this week has been absolutely insane. But speaking of things that create a lot of strong feelings here on the internet, today's video has been sponsored by Venice AI. And I know, hear me out, I know there's a lot of strong feelings regarding AI, as already said, and I would never advocate that you or I use it to replace people from doing real work. I need to stress that my employees that support me and my channel are human, and they are also here in the United States. I do not abuse foreign cheap labor. That just needs to be said outright. That there was a time that I did tie up my editor in my basement, but that's a whole other story. Either way, I get the hesitation that people have with AI and feeding it your information. I mean, OpenAI has even hinted they may require government-issued IDs in the future. Would you feel comfortable giving your ID to use ChatGPT? Probably not. But that is where Venice AI can be such a useful tool to support you, as it is a private and completely uncensored AI. There are no content filters holding you back. You can explore any topic, ask any question. You can get a direct, unfiltered answer. It treats you like an adult who is actually capable of having a real conversation. But the best part of this, though, is privacy. Venice AI is completely private. Your chats and data are stored only on your browser, never on any of servers that they have. You can create, brainstorm, explore without a single worry about your data actually being tracked or stored. And if you go and pay for the Pro plan, you unlock advanced tools like PDF uploads for instant summaries, which for any student, researcher, or professional going through 200 pages of government documents can be a godsend. So that's what I'm advocating for. You can use something like this as a tool that is helpful. That is actually what I recommend, and you can do this by clicking my link down in the description and using my code HistoryOfEverything to get 20% off a Pro plan. Or just try the free version. It's nice. And at this point, before the angry comments start swarming, thank you Venice AI for sponsoring me on videos that, again, regularly get demonetized because of the subjects I talk about, thus allowing me to pay my editor to feed his family, as well as even support my own. Back to the show. Now, before it is that we begin, as always here on the History of Everything, we need to provide both a few notes and also provide some context. I'm going to be trying my best here at pronunciation, but there may be times where I have to default to a more standard American English pronunciation, just a heads up on that. And additionally, we are going to be dealing with a lot of economic data of, quite frankly, ridiculous sums. So in order to not get lost in the financial weeds, I'm going to try and round numbers as much as I can, unless that specific number is really important. Lastly, there's a degree of simplification that we're going to have to do on some things that we're talking about in this episode. I don't mean that we're going to change things or remove important context, but there are some aspects that we just won't really have time to get into. That being said, and you can let me know down in the comments section here below, we may return to some of these topics later for their own deep dive, just like what we did with California Rail, which you all really seem to like. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and by the way, before it is that I continue or go any further, I do want to mention specifically that for those of you who have been complaining that I do more stuff that is tied to geopolitics versus history, if you want to see more pure history content from me, I do have the actual History of Everything podcast that is on Spotify that is just pure random history on different stuff. And if you want to watch that on YouTube here, the channel is linked down below. It's called History Hose, though I'm probably going to be changing that to something like History with Stakuyi or something along those lines. So if you want pure history content, check that out because we are really trying to build that channel up if you want to see pure history content. Either way, back to the show. Now, it's probably a good idea to give you some background on just what kind of place Saudi Arabia is and who the people are before it is that we look at what makes Vision 2030 so incredibly important. With the Red Sea to the west and the Persian Gulf to the east, Saudi Arabia is home to some 34 million people, with around 7 million of that population living in the capital of Riyadh. The country's natural resource exploitation, mainly in the form of petroleum and natural gas, make it the largest economy in the Arab world and in the top 20 globally. This is a country whose name itself is basically synonymous around the world with oil. Now, those energy reserves are massive too. After Venezuela, they have the largest reserve of oil in the world, with estimates putting it somewhere between 267 and 297 billion barrels, or around 20% of global reserves as of 2023. But also, what's important to note here is that while it is that they are technically second in terms of those oil reserves, simultaneously, they are the ones with some of the best oil in the world, as the majority of the oil that Venezuela has is in fact of terrible low quality that cannot be used to refine into, well, gasoline very easily. But while this resource has come to define the country of Saudi Arabia in modern times, this was not always the case. Oil wasn't really discovered in Saudi Arabia until 1938, incidentally less than a decade from the establishment of the modern iteration of Saudi Arabia in 1932. This being when well number 7 would strike the first of many deposits in the Jebel Duran region. Up until that point, the country's economy was mostly something that revolved around agriculture, which sounds a little bit weird here for the desert, but the population was significantly smaller at that time. And, of course, from the revenues that would be generated by pilgrims on their Hajj, which is the Muslim holy pilgrimage that must be made to the city of Mecca that is controlled by Saudi Arabia. But with the discovery and exploitation of oil reserves, the Saudi economy would rapidly transform. The Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, would continue their development of these oil fields, expanding production. In their zeal to find more areas to drill, Aramco would inadvertently instigate an awkward four-way international incident in 1949 between the US-backed Saudis and the British-backed Emirate of Abu Dhabi. Following the 1950 London Agreement and the Emirates' reassertion of control over the oasis, King Ibn Saud would go and renegotiate the agreement with the company for an even splitting of profits, a 50-50 split. Now, this is something that is fairly common in the region, and that 50-50 split became par for the course with a lot of the future OPEC nations. By 1970, the Saudi government would start acquiring shares of the oil giant until it is that they owned the whole thing by 1980 and would rename it to the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, sometimes just seen as Saudi Aramco, in 1988. This is extremely important to note because it was during the 1970s and the acquisition that the issue of oil would return to the arena of politics for the Saudi government. In October of 1973, the Yom Kippur War would start between Egypt, Israel, and Syria. The Nixon administration would send aid to Israel, and with these munitions, early Egyptian and Syrian gains were completely reversed. From there, Israeli troops would even go and cross into both countries. In response, the member nations of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Arabian members would vote to embargo the United States, leading to the 1973 oil crisis. At home, this resulted in rationing and changes in ways that Americans would drive, as well as, naturally from this, extremely high prices. In fact, by the end of the embargo, once it was lifted in 1974, the price per barrel of oil had more than quadrupled. With this sharp increase in price reversing a years-long downward trend and their complete ownership of Aramco, it's perhaps then somewhat unsurprising then to learn that the Saudis would maximize their refining capabilities to be a major player on the global market. They would take every advantage of this moment that they possibly could. And now, while this obviously has gained the country considerable wealth in the last 50 years, it has come at a significant risk. A 2015 report would estimate that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the overall government revenue for that year came from the sale of oil and gas. And while prices stayed high and demand was high, this was a great system for the Saudis. However, during times of uncertainty or economic upheaval, this can be extremely detrimental to its overall health. With sharp drops in the price of oil in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and then the later US fracking boom around 2014, the Saudis would feel firsthand the budgetary pain of relying on an oil economy. In seeking to undermine domestic production in countries that typically imported their oil thanks to fracking, Saudi Arabia was forced to reckon with this dual political and economic crisis, now in part of their own making. When the price might drop by more than half in just a year, like it did from 2014 to 2015, the implications of this are absolutely catastrophic. And when I say that, to understand just how catastrophic we are talking about here, we need to understand just how significant the oil economy of Saudi Arabia is to the common person on the street of, say, Riyadh. You see, the Saudi administrative state is massive. The United States, for example, employs around 10 to 15% of its population, depending upon the year, in the public sector. And this can be things like whether you're talking clerks, attorneys, diplomats, or quite honestly, it's like, a majority of postal workers, something like that. But when you go and contrast that with Saudi Arabia, which in 2015 employed almost 70% of its total workforce in the public sector, like paid on behalf of just the government, not 17, 7D, you can imagine then, if you're a government in 2015 in Saudi Arabia during the oil crash, your budget income literally just halved, and the expenses have stayed the same. You're faced with a bit of a crisis. Do you go and cut jobs or services? What happens if the price goes back up? It's all a mess. If you went and cut services and jobs, then that would likely exacerbate the, at the time, already growing unemployment rate. Which, mind you, in 2014, when all this was happening, this was already over 11%. It was not something that was good. But in the end, the Saudis were forced to issue bonds and look to foreign reserves to meet the budget shortfalls. At the height of the crisis in 2015, estimates were that the country had less than 5 years before insolvency. Like, it would have gone bankrupt if things had stayed at that level. And that was 11 years ago at the time that I'm making this here in 2026. You can see how that would be a bit of a problem. So then, to recap, the Saudis had by 2010 established a thriving oil-based economy that provided or made them one of the top global economies, despite having a population that was a fraction of the size of many other economies that were of the same size. But in large part, their economy lived and died by just the price of oil, which is already enough for most economies to contend with. However, there was one more complicating factor in the situation that made the ideal conditions for change in 2015. You see, in 2015, after serving for a decade on the throne, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia would die at the age of 90. As a monarchy, the death of Abdullah would immediately inaugurate a wave of changes in the Saudi government. Most importantly, for our purposes today, was the appointment of Mohammed bin Salman to be the new defense minister. Shortly after taking office, Salman would increase Saudi intervention in Yemen against the Houthis. At the same time, he also oversaw Aramco and later the broader and newly created Council of Economic and Developmental Affairs. Basically, this was the ministry that oversaw economic policy and development for the country. Under his leadership, Aramco would expand further, even going so far as to make the company public and listing it on the Saudi stock exchange, the Tadawul. While this certainly did help stabilize Aramco to some degree, Salman's most important contribution is actually the focus of our video today. 2015 was a wake-up call for the Saudis. The volatility of the market and the, at the time, beginning stages of the alternative energy boom would underscore the need to diversify their income streams. This was always something that had kind of been known, but was mostly ignored until it is that it completely slapped them in the face. While the oil fields opened by Well 7 had enriched the country, reliance on it could just as easily reverse these fortunes and doom the entire state. So then, what to do? How could the Saudis reverse this trend and prepare their economy for its next major phase? Well, on April 25th, 2016, Mohammed bin Salman would propose the new and radical course change for the Saudi economy, one that he hoped would safeguard the country for generations to come. During an interview with state-owned broadcaster Al Arabiya, Salman would go and unveil a new series of initiatives and projects that he dubbed Vision 2030. Contained within the revitalization campaign would be three major aims. 1, a vibrant society. 2, a thriving economy. And 3, an ambitious nation, which is very generic, but on the face of things, that does sound great. What exactly does it mean, though? Well, we're going to need to peek at each one of these three pillars in practice. But before it is that we do, I have to stress here, this is a mind-bogglingly massive project. At the outset, the project was expected to cost not billions, but trillions of dollars, and now that cost has ballooned even more. So rather than providing a comprehensive list of key elements of these pillars, I'm going to have to focus on a few aspects that really help to underscore the intent of 2030. First, the vibrant society aspect. The plan would call for, in its own words, and I quote, creating strong roots that embrace modern Islam, national pride, Saudi heritage, and culture, while also providing world-class entertainment options, sustainable living, and efficient health and social care systems, end quote. Stripping away some of the more aspirational language of the report, this pillar aims to strengthen Saudi national identity, to enhance the quality of life of its people, improve urban environments, and develop the tourism industry. To do this, the plan would call for a variety of domestic and international efforts in the cultural and health sphere. Now, this pillar would result in significant investments in interior infrastructure and cultural heritage sites. Sites like Al-Ula, which is located on the oasis of the same name, and Diriyah, the historic birthplace of the Saudi state in the 18th century, have received massive investments, with over $22 billion invested between 2018 and 2024. Diriyah, one of the largest projects in Vision 2030, will be entirely reconstructed to something similar to what American viewers might associate with a site like Colonial Williamsburg. A mix of historic and modern, designed to capture the essence of the past, but still present it in a modern context. Similarly, Al-Ula has undergone archaeological conservation and revitalization effort. Founded in the 12th century, the city's old town was abandoned between 1983 and 1985 due to its crumbling infrastructure and cramped quarters. But as part of Vision 2030, the city has conserved roads, houses, and mosques to attract new residents, and businesses in historic fashion, utilizing traditional wood structural supports, mud bricks for homes, and even woven palm ceilings. Concurrently, with these larger projects have been massive investments in smaller cultural projects. In total, the country has invested almost $22 billion into cultural institutions like museums, libraries, galleries, cultural centers, while also funding artistic exhibitions like the Riyadh Comedy Festival in 2025, which was its own thing entirely, and I'm not necessarily going to get into, but there were a lot of complications with that and strong feelings online, and the Red Sea International Film Festival. Either way, while the Vibrant Society pillar has invested significant sums into historic preservation, it has done so in a distinctly curated fashion. Diriyah and Al-Ula are often seen as constructed narrative spaces designed to selectively reframe Saudi history to reinforce a narrative of national memory rather than just telling straight history. It is something that is a matter of pride. From here, though, onto the second pillar, an ambitious nation. Now, this pillar, my friends, calls for increasing the capacity, the transparency, and modernization of the country, while empowering benevolent organizations and increasing civic participation. Of the three pillars, this is perhaps the most broad in its aims, as what I just said here sounds extremely generic, if not also referring to the impacts that it would have or is supposed to have. Once again, turning to the report's language, it says the aim is to change Saudi Arabia into a country that, quote, is effectively governed, transparent, and accountable, encouraging all of society, citizens, businesses, and nonprofit organizations to take the lead in identifying and pursuing opportunities to advance our collective future, end quote. So yeah, literally just addressing everyone and saying, all right, guys, let's make this place better. These reforms are likely the most significant as well due to their more daily impact on Saudi life. First, the plan would call for economic diversification and improved sustainability at the national level. Through the Fiscal Balance Program, Saudi Arabia would go and reduce their dependence on their petroleum reserves. They have done this primarily through diversification of non-oil industries to export things like manufactured goods, food products, and minerals like gold, copper, and rare earth metals. This has been a partial success, as the 2025 budget only drew just over half of its revenue from oil, which is down significantly from just over a decade previous. But it's not really enough, and we're going to get into that here later. Next, the pillar of the ambitious nation calls for administrative reform and modernization across the government. 5 new ministries would be established in the government, including the Ministry of Investment, the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Sport, the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of the Hajj and Umrah. Now, these new departments were announced in 2018, with each designed to oversee specific areas of new development of the pillar. And with this expansion has come increased modernization intended to make the government more efficient and transparent. Digitization has been a large priority, with the Digital Government Authority acting as a support body for the other agencies to digitize services or processes. Their first foray into this was through first a website and then now an app called AbShare, which is essentially a platform that helps you do things like renew your passport, pay a ticket, or get some documents without having to actually go down to your local ministry office that handles that kind of thing. They even have added an online platform for Muslims that seek to take their Hajj in 2019, which makes the government overseen process of getting a visa much simpler. Now, while the ambitious society pillar mentions the expanded transparency and effectiveness of government, the number of decision makers has decreased rather than increased, which presents a little bit of a problem. Royal councils and decrees make most of the decisions, limiting the already restricted participatory possibility for the average Saudi. And although Vision 2030 promotes volunteerism and benevolent societies, it does so through strict regulation and oversight. Organizations must operate within strict rules, and society must remain carefully curated to maintain the status quo. Similarly, despite the modernization of Saudi governance producing measurable improvements, new issues have popped up in places of the old. While measures like the value-added tax did increase government revenues, it tripled from 5% to 15% in 2020, alongside a suspension of a cost of living adjustment for government workers. While described as an austerity measure in response to a budget deficit in the COVID-19 pandemic, this also simultaneously led to increased fiscal pressure on these segments, reducing their consumption and introducing an element of housing instability, which is its own issue entirely. Finally, from this, the last of the pillars is a thriving economy. While similar to the ambitious nation pillar in its aims, this pillar emphasizes the private sector more and is probably the most visible one to those outside of Saudi Arabia. The engine that drives all of this forward is the Public Investment Fund, or PIF, a massive investment arm designed to put oil money and budget surpluses to work. You likely have already seen the PIF in action with their purchase of Electronic Arts, EA, in 2025, which, yes, for those of you who did not realize that this happened, the Saudi government bought EA, which I know how people felt about EA already. That is something that is probably, we're going to see a number of things in the comment section talking about this for how they feel. Yeah, they would go and establish LIV Golf, and they would purchase partial or complete investments in a number of media ventures. As of just this year, the PIF is the 5th largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, holding a total of $1.15 trillion under management, many of which have been seen as questionable. The PIF would go and use this money to underwrite the massive giga construction projects that you've probably seen online. And as I promised, now is the time that we're going to actually be talking about them. And there's 2 that I really want to focus on: the line and the macabre. The more ambitious of the 2, the line, was a proposed 170-kilometer city that would be home to 9 million people, a full quarter of the nation's population. Designed to be a massive walkable city connected by a central rail line, the city was a marvel of engineering, or supposed to be. From the start, the project was extremely ambitious, with renderings oftentimes showing things like flying cars, internal microclimates, and robotic maids. All kinds of stuff. It was wild. A person was proposed to have all their needs met within a 5-minute walk, and need only 20 minutes to travel 170 kilometers from end to end via the rail line. You will be entirely unsurprised then to know that this project carried with it a massive bill, along with a lot of demands. The first phase alone was projected to cost around $400 billion in today's money when first announced in 2022. And that didn't really work out, but we'll get into that in a second. As for the other one, announced in 2023, the macabre, which means cube in Arabic, this was designed to be the largest single build structure in the world, with the total interior space being 2 million square meters, or around 22 million square feet. Now, for perspective, that is the equivalent of 20 Empire State Buildings. For anyone who might be in America and understands that. There was some criticism, naturally, surrounding this project from the start, with some saying that the structure too closely resembled the Kaaba, which is the cubic structure in Mecca that is holy within Islam. They broke ground in 2023, and by the end of 2025, over 10 million cubic meters of earth had been shifted in order to prepare the building's foundations. This was a truly massive undertaking. And really, when it is that we're talking about this, private investment and the PIF would fund most of these projects. From construction to investment, this is the most expensive arm of Vision 2030, and what we just listed here is 2 of the series of projects that either were proposed, have started, or are set to happen. And while the private sector is not perhaps as directionally impacted by the ebb and flow of oil markets, they do feel the impact in a secondary sense. A decrease in oil profits results in lower investment availability, or in critical instances, using the fund itself to meet financial needs. While the sovereign fund is undoubtedly large, if the lessons of 2014 were properly learned, it cannot be assumed to be sacrosanct. But the thing is, with the increased level of publicity, so too has the degree of criticism towards the PIF's foreign investments increased, whether this was founded in reality or otherwise. LIV Golf, for example, was stringently opposed by the American PGA, with almost 20 golfers, including major figures in the league, banned for participating in LIV events. Similarly, the purchase of EA by the PIF in 2025 received extremely harsh online criticism from both individuals and the United States government, with some fears that the company would downsize and remove jobs from the United States to improve profitability. Finally, there is the issue of the giga projects themselves. With massive construction efforts across the country, controversy has gone up with the pylons. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled, with tens of thousands displaced by these projects, with little or nothing to really show for it. In some instances, violence or the threat thereof was used to force individuals from their homes to make room for said projects, that many of which never seemed to get created in the first place. And really, when I'm talking about this, it's during this next section that I would like to discuss some of the more controversial aspects of Vision 2030 that don't directly necessarily correlate to one pillar. In addition to its high employment in the public sector, the Saudi economy makes use of what is known as the kafala, or sponsorship system. In short, there is a visa system like any other country, but under the kafala system, the visa is tied to the employer rather than to the individual. This means that sponsors have an immense amount of power over their employees. At its most strict, the kafala system can control a worker's ability to change jobs and even prevent them from leaving the country. Typically, individuals in this system occupy jobs in the construction, hospitality, domestic service, and most importantly to the Saudis, oil and gas industries. Now, of course, this system has been heavily criticized by international organizations like the Human Rights Watch for issues like non-payment of wages, confiscation of passports, forced labor, and contract substitution, which, in essence, for those of you who do not know what it is that we're talking about, this is, in essence, signing up for one job, getting there, and then learning, oh no, that job actually doesn't exist, you're going to be doing something entirely different. Oh, what's that? You don't want to actually do this job that we're offering you for a pay and status that is completely different than what was promised? Well, too bad. We're going to take your passport and make you work anyway, basically turning you into a slave. Yeah, for anyone who remembers the whole issue with Qatar and FIFA, you'll know what it is that I'm referring to there. The reason I bring this up is that all of these projects require massive quantities of labor on the part of the Saudis. While they do possess a sizable population, a significant quantity of individuals in the country are part of the kafala system, which we discussed earlier. You will not be surprised then to learn that these same criticisms have magnified during the rush to meet Vision 2030. Comprising almost 80% of the private sector workforce, these workers likely comprise a significant percentage of the construction crews for giga projects like The Line and the Macabre. But, unfortunately, specific numbers are not actually available. Compounding the issue of the kafala system is the physical spaces required for these projects themselves. As we mentioned here before, part of this project is a significant revitalization of urban areas that includes making things like parks, wider streets, avenues, tourist districts, and so much more. But as is the case in many cities, there are a lot of people living in a lot of places. To keep the project moving as quickly as possible, then, the government has resorted to evicting people in areas that are deemed high priority for land use under the project period, and in some instances, individuals have less than 24 hours to vacate their homes before it is just demolished. For example, in the city of Jeddah, revitalization efforts were expected to impact more than 500,000 residents in the city. Of those impacted, just under half are workers under the kafala system. Between October of 2021 and May of 2022 alone, at least 20 neighborhoods across the city were destroyed to make way for new construction and urban revitalization. In one of these neighborhoods, the Al Galil neighborhood, residents were quite literally given 24 hours after notification that they needed to move before their electricity was completely cut off. It is that rapid, and that is what kind of authoritarian measures we are talking about here. If all of this is not clear by now, Vision 2030 is very obviously an ambitious plan. Any one of these pillars might take 15 or 20 years to accomplish on their own, let alone in conjunction with the others that we have mentioned here in the first place. And at its core, the project is still vulnerable due to the inherent conditions present in Saudi Arabia. Any meaningful progress on Vision 2030 must inherently be understood as happening despite the fluid political and economic conditions of the last decade. Lower than anticipated oil prices for a significant period of the plan's life have led to an exacerbation of existing budget shortfalls that first reared its ugly head with the oil price collapse in 2014. In specific, the plan anticipated that oil would stay somewhere between $86 and $92 per barrel, but the reality has been closer to 60 to 70. While in small quantities this may seem like a small gap, over the approximately 10 million barrels produced per day, this becomes an untenable situation extremely quickly, where we are talking about billions and billions and billions in potentially lost revenue. This is on top of factors like the emergence and surge in popularity of electric vehicles and renewable energy, as well as global events like COVID and the war in Ukraine that significantly reduced demand overall, either directly or through motivation to seek renewable energy sources. To put it bluntly, the Saudis gambled on oil holding its value, but neither demand nor price would go and support these estimates. And this is hardly a new issue either. By 2022, major budget deficits already threatening key aspects of Vision 2030 would get worse. By the end of 2025, that deficit was over $25 billion. Projects like The Line were scaled back as a result, from 1.5 million people projected to call the city home over its 170 kilometers, down to just 2.4 kilometers, housing some 300,000 people. Other projects, like the Macabre, have been suspended indefinitely, and likely not seriously considered for some time. Despite having little to no significant progress even as late as 2022, the project is yet another casualty of overexuberance in planning, with limited consideration for the realities of cross-desert construction. It is worth noting, while the loss of particularly significant giga projects is a very public reversal of the fortunes of Vision 2030, this is not to say that the project has in its entirety been a failure. Instead of focusing on these very tangible aspects of the plan, investment has shifted to provide a better sustainable base through which any potential future return to the bigger project of Vision 2030, or potentially a reimagined Vision 2030, could be realized. The PIF's emphasis on international investment has been toned down by almost a third, to focus instead on domestic spending. But even with this drastic reduction, international investment still comprises something like 10 times what it did in 2016, with a final aim of 20% foreign investment of the PIF's portfolio. So while Vision 2030 set out to be an ambitious revitalization of a kingdom poised at a crossroads of economy, culture, and modernity, it is unlikely to fully realize Mohammed bin Salman's 2016 vision. The reality of the global economic and political situation in the decade that followed the unveiling of the plan means that many of the initial assumptions underpinning the project were, to put it mildly, overly optimistic, complicating its prospects and planning. Additional controversy during its execution has also generated intense international criticism, especially regarding labor systems, governance practices, and societal restrictions. This all led to the kingdom making selective reforms. While reforms remain uneven and incomplete, modifications to systems like the kafala system and the expansion of social freedoms would mark critical steps forward in the realization of intertwined societal and economic aspects of the plan. It's complicated, it really is. However, again, all this is not to say that the plan cannot at least be considered a partial success. An ongoing economic transition and the continued expansion of the PIF do clearly indicate that the concerns which initially prompted Vision 2030 are being actively reckoned with. While political instability and the global expansion of renewable energy present long-term challenges, petroleum does remain the lifeblood of the global economy. It may therefore be the very anxieties that gave rise to 2030 may now sustain its evolution, now almost a Vision 2030 2.0. Though, that all being said, 2030 is still in and of itself more ambitious. 2040 seems to be a little bit more accurate. Continued diversification and investment in emerging sectors such as artificial intelligence could very well represent the next well number 7 to the Saudis and give them new economic booms. Although many of the flagship projects still do remain dependent on proceeds from the petroleum industry, the significant domestic and international investments undertaken by the Public Investment Fund could generate the stability that is necessary to sustain longer-term socioeconomic transformations. Really, who knows? We may even actually get the giant cube back when everything is said and done. It could happen. Maybe. We will really see. At minimum, the kingdom has demonstrated a willingness to adjust from a completely unsustainable course in response to pressure, even if that means reducing the scope and impact, or even suspending work altogether on some projects. Really, as it is, only time, luck, and the ability to adapt in the face of economic uncertainty will determine whether or not Vision 2030 is something that will create the dream society that its architects envision, or whether it will continue to be more of a nightmare for financial planners. But that right there, my friends, is the end of today's video. And I know from the very start of this, when people are actually looking at this and they're going, oh man, hey Zach, you're talking about Saudi Arabia and all this stuff here now, but what about Afghanistan or Pakistan? What about Mexico? Or more importantly, as I'm sure that many of you probably said at the very beginning of this video, what about Iran? Yeah, trust me when I say I'm going to be getting into all of that. This was written and prepared before it is that I had gotten back, but for many of you that may not have seen my post that I had made here over the past weekend, I was in South Carolina for a LARPing event and didn't have access to my phone for the majority of time. So, you know, we were living in medieval England, basically, in the middle of South Carolina, completely cut off from everything. So when it is that I stepped into the event there on Saturday and people are talking about, oh, did you hear what happened in Iran? Yeah, that was a shocking thing to experience when it is that I'm in full armor and kit. We're gonna get into that. Trust me, that's probably going to be something that's going to be a longer series in here. The world decides to light itself on fire every single time I travel, and I will never escape the allegations. But with that, my friends, we're going to end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below what kind of things you would like to see next. I got a lot of suggestions for my previous video when talking about things for the California Rail Project. If there's other kinds of things that you want to see, I saw some people talking about the was it the Cleveland or the Cincinnati subway thing? That's another one I probably need to look at here in the future to create. But either way, thank you all for watching. Let me know what you want to see, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.